Kyle Bradge from Chaparral Motorsports out here with Michael Lindsay today at Milestone MX Park. Today we want to talk about bringing home a brand new bike. So Michael, you're super stoked, you're at the dealership, you pick up your first motocross bike, you get out to the track. What are some of the key things that are must-dos before you throw a leg over and take a lap?
Well, let's put it bluntly. If you go out and get a new bike, awesome. They're big purchases, but they are. It's absolutely fantastic to get a new motorcycle, but that's the thing. You spend all that money to get a new bike. There are a few key things. I know everybody's like, oh, I got to get the suspension done. I got to get the exhaust, etc. There's a lot of things you can do yourself for free that honestly will make a bigger difference than any of those items. So starting off, it comes down to some suspension-related things. Everybody here set sag. If you've never set sag before, find a buddy that has. Look up tutorials. I believe there is one up on probably your guys' channel. There's one on mine. But learn how to set the sag properly. That changes the weight balance of the bike. Getting that set up will basically start off you on a right motion. Because a lot of times a guy will get a bike, and if they're quite a bit heavier or under what the OEM related spec is, you might be really tall in the rear or really low. And that's going to affect not just the way the bike handles, but also the load on the suspension on each end. If it's really low in the rear, you're basically going to be being too much pressure on the rear shock at all times, not enough weight on the front end. And if it's too tall in the rear, you're going to have weight off the rear end. The rear shock's probably going to feel stiff, and the forks are going to have a lot of constant weight on them. There's a lot of other, we can go into details, there's more in those videos, but if you just start by getting the balance of the bike correct, that's a huge place to start. In the case of this KTM, we also have an air fork. You want to make sure that that is set properly at the track to the OEM spec. And then a really big one is tires. A lot of guys will set tires at their house. I'm hugely adamant about doing it at the track because in case here, if we go to a track that's a little bit higher elevation or a little bit lower elevation, the tire pressure changes half a pound, a full pound. That's a big difference. We talk about, once again, all this stuff like guys will do suspension and everything. If they're a little bit low on tire pressure, they'll make a few complaints. I'll check their front tire pressure and it's 11.5 and it needs to say be 13 for that tire. Pump at 13 and it's a night and day difference for them. So it's just little things like that. If you're going to go through the effort of getting the new bike, why not take that extra 10 minutes to dial in all the little things?
Now really quick, for those that have never before heard of sag before, layman's term, what is sag?
Sag is the preload set on your rear spring. So you measure it statically on the stand and then you measure it once the rider sits on it. If you have too much sag, the rear end is too low because there is not enough preload on your rear shock spring. If it is too high, it's because there is too much preload set on the shock spring. So that is all adjustable on pretty much every modern day motocross bike. There is the ability to break the preload rings loose or another item on the side of the shock that allows you to basically turn the preload rings to lock down the shock spring more or take tension off of it.
Perfect. Okay, so now let's dig into, we talked about preload, we talked about suspension. Now you're about ready to talk about air forks. How are air forks different than standard traditional forks?
So if you actually take one apart, they're very similar. You still have a cartridge inside which has oil and shims in it that create damping force. The outer chamber of the fork still has oil in it, and actually, to be exact, all coil springs technically have air in it. It's just neutral. That's why we have guys that bleed their forks, and that's another one we'll get to in a second. Just instead of in a coil spring, you have a metal coil in there that supports the fork. In an air fork, that chamber is sealed, and you're using air pressure to support the fork instead. So that air pressure is basically your coil spring. So if you're down, say, 5 PSI under what you should be, you're riding around on a bike with a spring rate less or more in the front, or if you're up high, you're riding on a stiffer spring rate. So having that precise is a huge deal because we ride spring fork bikes and that spring rate never changes. So it's a consistency. But in an air fork, you got to make sure you measure that properly, or basically every time you ride, you're going to have a different spring rate.
So the little bleeder caps at the top of the forks, you twist and let some air out. What are you doing when you're adjusting those?
The air fork will actually have a Schrader valve, which you tie a pump into. Having a really good pump is a key thing also. Usually the KTMs and the Husqvarnas will come with an air pump with them to adjust that. And then on a normal coil spring fork, yes, there is a blader. A lot of guys are using to bleeding the air out of your fork. And like I said, a coil spring fork does have air in there. And it feels stiffer when it heats up and that air expands because it's the same theory as an air fork. There's extra air inside that chamber, and it's creating more spring pressure. So on a coil spring fork, you always want to keep it neutral density with the outside air, so they'll break open the bleeder when it gets hot and drain the air out. That's another one with elevation. So basically, to give you my quick check through, I show up at the track. If I have a spring fork bike, I break open that bleeder up top, make sure it drains out any excess fork pressure. I will check my tire pressures. Typical things, I'll reach around, check the spokes while I'm doing that, my chain adjustment. Typically, sag is also one I try to recheck fairly often because, let's be honest, our body weight's all changed by a couple pounds. That throws it off. So every 2-3 weeks, if I have somebody with me or I have the tools, I'll check it myself or have someone help me check them. But that's a big one to do right off the bat. And then this whole time we've also been talking about what you do right when you get the bike. There is a few important steps to also check after you break in the bikes a ride or two. Frames do break in. The metal starts to flex. Everything starts to settle. I typically will recheck the sag after the first hour and a half to 2 hours because the spring will settle in and sometimes change. I will also find every major mounting point on the bike that has a torque figure, like your triple clamps, your engine mounts, your swing arm, and your suspension. I'll break all of that loose and reset the torque figures on because as the frame settles in, those materials will end up with a bind on them. Certain bikes are more rigid than others, say like the new Hondas and Suzukis. Those actually will make a really big difference after 2 hours. If you break everything loose and reset it to the stock torque figures again, the bike will almost feel like it flexes more. It will be like more comfort to the chassis.
Now, Michael, when it comes to a brand new bike, of course, we're supposed to scrub in tires, we're supposed to bed in brakes. There's things like that we're supposed to do before we go out there and hit them hard. How do you handle that type of stuff?
Well, at least with dirt, unlike street, scrubbing isn't too big of a deal on a motocross tire, so that's usually not a big deal. But definitely brakes, you want to make sure you roll out. Everybody's got their different theory. My favorite is I typically will roll through the pits, and I will start to just apply a little bit of pressure front to rear to settle in on the rotor and the pad. If one of them has a groove and the other doesn't, it starts to match that in. And as I head towards the track, I'll grab it a couple times hard to make sure it's grabbing, basically, that you're getting brake traction in a way against the rotor. You basically don't want to just go off first lap and send it because you don't want to be that guy going over a berm when you realize the rear brake is not settled in the first lap and you press and it goes either all the way down or it's just not, that pad is not setted into the rotor and you're just getting a lack of brake power the first couple sections on the track.
There you go. There's a couple key things to take a look at your new bike that you just brought home or your bike that you want to take a look at before you ride it the first time at the motocross track. I'm Kyle Bradford from Chaparral Motorsports. If you like what you saw today, give us a thumbs up. If you want more action like this coming directly to your inbox, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Until next time, take care and ride safe out there.